am so happy to be here. I'm not just happy to be here. I feel like an immense joy to be here. I don't know if any of you saw the Oscar acceptance speech that Roberto Benigni gave in 1999 when his World War II movie, Life is Beautiful, won. He basically stood up on stage and told the audience that he wanted to make out with them because he felt such joy. And that is how I feel right now. Joy because this event, this is my 10th RICO. The very first big coffee event I ever came to was RICO in exactly 10 years ago in this city. And it changed the trajectory of my career. So this event has meant a lot to me over the years for many reasons, but one of them is because it is probably the best place that I know of in this world, in this community that we all work in, to connect with people. It's a small event, it's intimate, you have time to actually build relationships. And many of the people that have meant the most to me in my coffee career come and gather here. And I don't know about you, but I miss you all. I miss you all a lot. And I'm just so, so happy that we can be here together today again. The other reason that RICO means a lot to me is because it's an amazing event. The people who put it on put a lot of time and attention into building an event that will be relevant and that tackles big, hard questions in coffee. And I want to acknowledge that putting on an event like this and creating space for all of us to come together takes a tremendous amount of work, most of which is invisible to us, sort of by design, right? You want a good event to feel seamless. And I just want to acknowledge that there are literally dozens of people who make this possible, and they have poured their hearts and souls into building this event for us and an opportunity for us to gather. So thank you to all of the staff at SCA, behind the scenes, behind the curtains, for making this possible. And I'm actually going to put you on the spot and ask you to join me in clapping for them because it is so much work. Thank you. So one of the reasons that I think RICO is such a cool event is because they do tackle these big questions. And I'm not sure that there is a bigger question to tackle, if you are the Specialty Coffee Association, than what is specialty coffee? Kim just gave us a really great kind of introduction about this moment that we're in, sort of being in between waves at the end of something, but we're not entirely sure what the next thing is yet. And we're going to explore over the next hour and a half, 2 hours in this session, an angle on that question related to the very beginning, where this all goes back to and where I always love to start, which is with the plant itself. What is specialty coffee as a plant, embodied in a plant? And I think one of the things that's true about the history of specialty coffee and our relationship to this plant is that for about as long as this concept of specialty has existed, going back 4 or 5 decades now, it has been kind of married to one plant, Coffea arabica, which is the dominant species that we grow and consume around the world. About 60% of coffee production is Coffea arabica. But there are other species that we drink, right? We drink Coffea canephora, which is commonly known as Robusta. Increasingly, you may have heard some other names of coffee species, Coffea liberica, or eugenioides, or Stenophila, or racemosa. So how did specialty coffee get married to this one plant? I'm going to offer one version of that story. There are many. About as long as humans have been engaging in commerce with one another, they have been trading plants, right? Going back to the very beginning. Plants for medicine, plants for fiber, plants for hallucinogenic experiences, right? We have been working with plants and moving plants around the world, first over land and then by sea for a very long time. And Arabica coffee first sort of climbed down out of the forests in Ethiopia about 500 years ago. Originally moved, we think, by folks who were using it for religious devotions, and then eventually began to be traded around the Arabian Sea, and then eventually became one of the staple commodities that was used by empire builders and the colonial powers as they moved around the world. And really the purpose of all of this was to try to capture and build wealth. They were using plants, many different kinds of plants, but coffee was one of them, to try to build their empires, solidify their power, and of course we know that changed the trajectory of history, and it also came at great cost, environmental cost and human cost as well, particularly in the form of slavery. But Arabica coffee was really the only coffee that was moving around for the first few hundred years of the history of coffee. Then about 100 years ago, a little bit more, Robusta coffee began to be cultivated in the regions where it originates, which is West Africa and Central Africa, whereas Arabica comes from East Africa and the forests of Ethiopia. As Robusta began to slowly gain a foothold, it was being grown in these new regions and eventually began to be picked up by colonial powers and moved around, in particular into Asia. As it began to gain dominance, which really took off over the second half of the 20th century, particularly as Vietnam cranked up its production of Robusta coffee to become the second largest producer in the world, Arabica, which used to own the story of coffee, right? That's all there was for a very long time, suddenly had to figure out how to differentiate itself. It had to figure out how to tell a story about itself that made this upstart Robusta cousin to put it in perspective, right? Because Robusta was growing at lower elevations. It was grown in areas where Arabica hadn't been able to grow very successfully before. Arabica generally is grown at higher elevations, and it is more expensive to grow. So you have this coffee that's a little more expensive and this upstart that's suddenly everywhere, and Arabica needs to find a way to justify its continued existence. And so a story develops about Arabica being good and Robusta being bad. And this story is beginning to develop right around the time that the sort of second wave of coffee is coming into the market. So about as long as specialty has existed, you've had the story about Arabica being the good quality coffee, Robusta being the bad, cheap coffee. And that has basically been a kind of underlying story in our industry for as long as it has existed. And today, as we're pausing to talk about what is specialty coffee, we're going to talk about how that definition is beginning to broaden and change, because the world doesn't stand still, right? This is one thing we've all learned over the last couple of years. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, from a few different perspectives, the perspective of wild coffees, which are emerging in new ways. We're seeing them show up at barista competitions. We're reading scientific papers about their potential. We're going to explore a little bit what their potential is in the specialty coffee industry. We're going to talk about Robusta. What is the role of Robusta in the specialty world? Is there room for Robusta in the world of specialty coffee? And we're also going to talk a little bit about processing, because another thing that we've taken for granted for a very long time is that when we talk about specialty coffee, we're mostly talking about washed Arabica coffee. But as you all are, I'm sure, very well aware, there has been a huge proliferation of experimentation and exciting sort of pushing of the boundaries when it comes to processing. So we're going to explore all three of those things through the lens of this question, what is specialty coffee? So that's what we're going to do over the next little bit. First, we're going to have a panel. Then we're going to have two individual speakers. And then we're going to go out and we're actually going to chance to taste some wild coffees that you probably have not had a chance to taste before. So that's going to be very exciting and special. And we have a number of the growers here with us today to answer your questions.